Hello interwebs, I hope you're all doing well. Unfortunately, for today's video, I kind of want to talk about a recent incident involving comedian Dave Chappelle here, namely the incident where he was attacked on stage by someone from the crowd during his Hollywood Bowl comedy set in Los Angeles. Now, initially I didn't plan on talking about this incident at all, considering that it doesn't really touch upon any of the issues that I normally talk about on this channel, namely LGBTQ and transgender issues, and the only sort of direct link to any of those discussions happens to be that this incident happened to Dave Chappelle himself, who is a comedian who was fairly controversial these past few months, considering some of the things that he discussed in his recent Netflix special, The Closer, surrounding transgender people. Namely that a lot of transgender people, myself included, found a lot of his words to be harmful and hurtful, leading to a big pushback from the transgender community, as well as a lot of employees of Netflix itself surrounding his words, leading to a protest of Netflix employees outside of the company, as well as a larger backlash against Dave Chappelle himself, and then many people on the right and Dave Chappelle himself also stating that they saw this as evidence of cancel culture, trying to silence somebody for free speech who was just trying to talk about transgender people, and transgender people just getting upset because we can't take jokes and it's just another version of the woke mob coming for Chappelle or whatever comedian person that's being discussed because we talked about trans people. Now, obviously, there's a lot more context about that, and I'll get into it a little bit more specifically down the line in this video. But other than that link to the topic at hand, there really didn't seem to be anything to discuss with this incident surrounding the stuff that I normally talk about, especially considering that the person that tried to attack Chappelle was a cisgender man, having nothing to do with the transgender community at all. However, as days have gone by since the incident, I've seen a very troubling and concerning trend surrounding how this incident has been discussed, specifically in regards to trans people. Because despite the fact that, again, we had nothing to do with this, some of the things that Chappelle said immediately after the incident, namely that he joked that the man was a trans man, we'll talk about that in a second. I think I'll have some things to say that people will be surprised that I will actually be forgiving of Chappelle on, and that, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But even more concerningly, how this incident has been taken and reported on, even by places that are typically very good at discussing trans issues in a trans context, and how that has led to, I have seen, harassment of not only myself, just as a trans person in an online space and someone who spoke about Chappelle months ago, having nothing to do with this incident, but also just trans people in general, and how I think that it's concerning considering not only what it says about this incident and how we discuss trans people surrounding people like Dave Chappelle, who are controversial within the trans community, but also the larger way that trans people are viewed and seen in our sort of discourse in society today, and how that continually leads to further and further and increasing violence and harassment against transgender people, both online and in physical public spaces. And so I want to talk about all of that because I do find it to be deeply concerning. But before I get into a sort of reiteration of the incident and what happened, I want to say first and foremost, because I think this is the most important thing to say about this incident, is that I am earnestly and honestly incredibly glad that Dave Chappelle is doing seemingly well after the incident, that he seems to be perfectly physically fine. I hope that he is mentally okay. I know that this incident can be very scary for anybody, regardless of who they are, regardless of what they've said in the past. I know this can be a very scary, scary incident for somebody. And so I do just wish Chappelle well, and I am very glad that he is okay. And I think that that's the most important thing to really centralize with this. And so I just wanted to make sure that that was clear, because while I am going to be talking about this in a transgender context, I want to make sure that people know that I don't think that the transgender connection here is the most important thing here. And me discussing this within a transgender context is not me trying to make it all about trans people, because I know some people are going to take it that way, but me just talking about something that happened regarding this incident that I have a certain perspective on, not me trying to override a larger concern about Dave Chappelle's safety. So just wanted to make sure that that is right up front, because I know some people are going to say, well, this wasn't about you. Why do you have to always make it about transgender people? I want to make it very clear. Glad he's safe. So with that being said, let's talk about what happened. Dave Chappelle was performing a comedy set at the Hollywood Bowl, which was part of a set of numerous different comedians. People like Jon Stewart was there, I believe Chris Rock was there. Several major comedians were at this. It wasn't just a Dave Chappelle specific show. But during his set, a man named Isaiah Lee stepped onto the stage and ran and tackled Dave Chappelle. And as we later learned, he did have a dagger on his body, a dagger that looked like a fake handgun. But then immediately after tackling Dave Chappelle, security sort of tried to come at him and he ran off. And Dave Chappelle got up, and however, there were a few key things to note about what happened beyond that. First and foremost, before the man came up on stage to attack Chappelle, Dave Chappelle made a joke pretty much almost immediately right before this happened that he had been feeling unsafe given that there were many transgender people who were harassing him online and even sending him death threats because of his words about transgender people in the Closer special that I talked about earlier. And then once Isaiah Lee had been chased off and was being arrested and grabbed by security, Dave Chappelle himself made a joke that said, oh, it was a trans man that attacked him, leading to the crowd to laugh at that joke.
Thank you, son. It was a trans man.
So that's the basic broad strokes of the incident. We'll talk a little bit more about Isaiah Lee specifically in just a little bit, but that's basically what happened. And a lot of different conversations have sort of jumped off because of this. Some around security at the Hollywood Bowl, some around how many comedians feel like they feel unsafe now, considering after the incident with Will Smith and Chris Rock at the Oscars, people will feel like they can go up and attack comedians on stage and make that more socially acceptable, which is a whole other conversation that I'm not really going to touch upon here, but it is one that has stemmed out from this. As well as for the potential violent treatment of Lee during his arrest. But one of the leading ones that I saw in my personal circles as a trans person was surrounding the fact that Dave Chappelle had made that joke about it being a trans man immediately after him being attacked, despite the fact that, as we later learned, the man who attacked him was not trans at all. And a lot of people criticized Dave Chappelle for that joke immediately after the incident because they saw it as, in their words, a cheap shot at transgender people, vilifying us for something that we had nothing to do with. I've even seen people in certain Twitter spaces to go so far as to say this is evidence that Dave Chappelle actively hates and despises transgender people. And while I wouldn't necessarily go that far, I do understand the kernel of the criticism, but I do feel like a lot of that critique of Dave Chappelle's words are kind of forgetting the context in which they were said. But this is not to forgive him for this because I do have major issues with that joke, but I do think people forget that he was literally just attacked on stage. And the joke about it being a trans man that attacked him came off of the fact that just a few minutes earlier, he had said that he had felt unsafe around the transgender community. So there was like a direct link between that and that joke. It wasn't just like out of nowhere, there was like, it was a trans man, despite having and not having said anything about the transgender community. There was a sort of context that that joke was within, given that he had just been attacked. And also, like, I think it's a little bit harsh to critique the man for not thinking through every single thing perfectly after having literally just been tackled to the ground by a man with a deadly weapon. And so I think that that criticism targeted directly at the joke as having some sort of direct malicious intent right after the fact, I think is a misunderstanding of what exactly happened and probably what Chappelle was feeling in that moment. However, what I do find to be more telling and honestly more concerning to me is the fact that that was the joke that he reached for as sort of an instinctive one right after that incident, after having been harmed and attacked. And also the fact that even before the incident, he was talking about feeling unsafe because of the transgender community. I think those two things in conjunction, the subconsciousness of it and the fact that he was talking about it beforehand, are actually more telling to me than actually someone thinking that Dave Chappelle had malicious intent in trying to directly vilify the transgender community right after this incident. And it gets to the heart of really what I want to talk about here. Because after the Closer came out, a lot of the prevailing discussions around how people saw the transgender community reacting to the special was that Dave Chappelle was being canceled by the trans community for just jokes about the trans community. And that we were just trying to cancel him and we were a woke mob coming after him. And what it sort of painted the trans community as overly sensitive, aggressive, angry, vitriolic, and hateful.
So his speech is violence, their violence is speech. See how that works?
And this is something that Dave Chappelle himself played into with him saying after the fact that he felt like trans people were just yelling at him and not actually listening to him and wanting to have a conversation.
To the transgender community, I am more than willing to give you an audience, but you will not summon me. I am not bending to anybody's demands.
However, if you actually listen to what a lot of the most prominent trans people were saying, myself included in this video, what we were saying is trying to have a nuanced discussion about what Dave Chappelle was talking about in his special. Because our basic criticisms, and this is something that I said in my video, again, I'm on record with this, but a lot of other prominent transgender people were saying this, including people who were employees at Netflix or quit Netflix or talked about Dave Chappelle immediately after the incident, were saying is that we didn't want Dave Chappelle canceled, but what we were trying to get at is a lot of his jokes that he was making weren't really jokes, and he may have seen them as jokes, but a lot of what they were things that transgender people hear every day as harassment against us. The best way that I can probably describe what I'm saying this without doing a whole video on it is to just say that a lot of his jokes may have seemed novel and new to a cisgender audience who didn't know much about the transgender community, but the things that he was saying as jokes were things that are often used to say to harass and attack trans people in public and online spaces. It's not new or novel to us, and usually we only hear it when we are being harassed. To make a kind of comparison to help illuminate what I'm trying to say, it was kind of like if, to a degree, a white comedian went up on stage and just started to say jokes that we now know as racism, but just said in a funny way. And white people in the audience laughing at that because they didn't understand how those statements were commonly used towards black people to attack and harass them because they didn't have an understanding of black people's experiences, which is something we've seen in onstage comedy history. This isn't to say that trans and racial issues are the same or of the same level, but just using that as an example to describe the dynamic here, and the criticism being leveled at Chappelle. On top of that, one of the things he talked about in the special is that he was Team TERF, that he was on the side with people like J.K. Rowling, who have spoken out against transgender people. And seemingly placing TERFs as just people asking questions about women's issues and transgender people, and they just view transgender people as, I think in his words, were blackface for women. And it misses the context that, and I've talked about this in numerous other videos, that many TERFs and gender-critical feminists, like Rowling and other people as well, are not just asking questions about the transgender community, or not just talking about women's rights in a transgender context, but a lot of TERFs are directly attacking and harassing the transgender community, focused directly on the transgender community. I mean, you have things like the LGBT Alliance in the United Kingdom, which is a gender-critical TERF group, attacking LGBTQ rights in general, targeting things like Stonewall, advocating against transgender rights in different legislations, Rowling herself being cited in numerous anti-transgender legislations throughout the United States and United Kingdom, things like anti-transgender healthcare bills, as well as a lot of misinformation that many gender-critical feminists try to push surrounding the transgender community that have now become more and more mainstream to try and target transgender rights issues. And so a lot of transgender people were pushing back against that specific part of his special, that we didn't find his jokes particularly funny, not because we can't take a joke. Many trans people can take a joke, believe us, we can. Like, there's a lot of things that you can make fun about transgender people. We're very weird, it's strange, it's totally cool. But that a lot of his jokes were just harassment, and that he gave credence to a group that has very targetedly and directly attacked the transgender community. And if you don't believe me on that or don't understand the context of that, I made this video as well that goes into that in further detail. But then on top of that though, and I said this again in my video, and I know many other transgender people said this as well, that he did actually have salient points to make in his initial special. That he did have a point to make about how many LGBTQ people, white LGBTQ people specifically, could still enact racist actions like calling the police on a black man during an incident. It was actually a salient point about how there's an intersection between many white LGBTQ people being able to ignore the plight of people of color, black men specifically, because we are still white and we still have privilege even if we are LGBTQ and also face harassment and marginalization for that.
You think I hate gay people, and what you're really seeing is that I am jealous of gay people. Oh, I'm jealous. I'm not the only black person that feels this way. We blacks, we look at the gay community and we go, God damn it, look how well that movement is going.
But then again, there's also more criticism within that as him just painting the LGBTQ and transgender community as all one thing without recognizing that as gender-critical feminists themselves, who many times identify as lesbians, not all of them are lesbians, and not all lesbians are gender-critical feminists. Don't want to make sure I make that clear. But also missing that there's conflict within the LGBTQ community, as well as the fact that not every LGBTQ person is white, and that the most marginalized people, or some of the most marginalized people that we see, especially within the transgender community, but just in society writ large, are black transgender women, and other transgender women of color. And even the protest from employees of Netflix surrounding the special, if you looked at their actual demands surrounding the special, it wasn't that Dave Chappelle should, shut up, never talk, we hate Dave Chappelle, he sucks. A lot of the demands were asking to have more inclusive policies within Netflix, like hiring more transgender people, maybe trying to have more LGBTQ representative shows, having more specialists from transgender comedians, like giving transgender people a platform as well, so that the most predominant conversations about us aren't from a man who isn't part of the transgender community, but that actually we get to be included in the room, both behind the scenes and in front of the camera, surrounding discussions of our own issues. That was the largest conversation. So while there was this painting of the transgender community as a woke mob, actually, if you listen to what transgender people had to say, we had a lot of nuanced critique. And we didn't actually want Dave Chappelle to be silenced, but that we did think that he brought up salient points, but we also had larger concerns about the way that he discussed and framed transgender people. However, all of that got conflated as cancel culture. And this is something that I've talked about numerous times, but it's something we see a lot within cancel culture narratives, that it flattens all criticism of somebody as just the most vitriolic, hateful, and over the top. That even transgender people who are trying to be critical, kind, caring, open, as I hope I was trying to be, you'll tell me if I was or not, but all that gets conflated with someone going out and sending death threats against Dave Chappelle. That we're all sort of saying the same thing, that all transgender people are sending death threats to Dave Chappelle. And we see this numerous times with any sort of painting of the marginalized community. We see it with just black people in general, see it with the LGBTQ community in general, and we even see this directly again with transgender people, with like people like J.K. Rowling, who very often will like point to very over-the-top death threat, harassment from transgender people or transgender people allies in order to paint all transgender people's critiques as simply harassing, violent, and vitriolic. And then thereby painting to the mainstream discussion around transgender people as all of us being vitriolic, hateful, and angry. Now, to be clear, this is by no means saying that I don't think that that doesn't happen. I know that there are probably transgender people who send harassment, death threats, and anger and vitriol at people like Dave Chappelle or J.K. Rowling. It definitely does happen. But that most transgender people aren't that, and that most transgender people, myself included, would condemn that. I do not think it is okay to send death threats or harassment to Dave Chappelle at all. Criticism at him, yes. Some very targeted, stern criticisms as well, and very much just like shooting him down, but never harassment and death threats. Like, totally not appropriate. As well as us asking for him not to be given further platforms. Not that he can't talk or that he doesn't have a right to say what he wants to say, but that he doesn't deserve a platform like Netflix specials, especially if trans people are also not given one to talk about our own issues when we're being discussed, or be heard when we're talking about trans issues. But that's what cancel culture does. It paints people against you as the most hateful, vitriolic, and harmful version of them, so that you can then go and claim that you feel attacked and hurt, and thereby leading to your audience becoming more and more enamored with you and more protective of you, so that it builds up your niche audience. And we saw Dave Chappelle doing this quite directly, because very soon after the incident, what he did was that he went in front of sold-out crowds of people, because they were sold out to try and defend him from the woke mob, and he used the incident in order to sell tickets to a movie that had nothing to do with transgender people, saying that this is the movie that transgender people didn't want you to see.
Nobody will touch it. I'll tell you what I'll do. I will make it available for all of you in 10 American cities, going on sale in the next few days. You will be able to see this movie in its entirety, and you can see what they're trying to obstruct you from seeing. And you can judge for yourself. But you cannot have this conversation and exclude my voice from it. That is only fair. You have to answer the question, am I canceled or not?
Not to mention the fact that after all the controversy, Netflix gave him 4 more specials, and even a comedy tour, of which the Hollywood Bowl was one, as it was part of the Netflix is a Joke comedy tour. So not only were trans people not heard and our point of view ignored, but Dave Chappelle continued to reach career heights despite his overt support of an anti-transgender hate movement, while trans people were vilified by the media at the same time, using Chappelle's words of cancel culture. And so, while he did have salient things to say, it ended up feeling like, and I don't know whether this was intentional, I'm not inside the man's head, but it definitely appeared that he was using this cancel culture wave in order to bolster his pocketbook or bolster his brand, at the expense of throwing transgender people under the bus with not only his discussions around us and the misinformation that he spread around the TERF community, but also just the painting of transgender people as hateful, vitriolic, and angry. Not only that, but even within the special itself, Chappelle talked about one of his fellow transgender comedians that he considered a friend who died by suicide after, as Chappelle claims, she received a ton of harassment from the transgender community for defending Chappelle for his words on trans people before this special that he had said. However, many people noted, including the trans comedian's roommate, that this necessarily wasn't the case, that this comedian was dealing with a lot, including a lot of harassment for being trans just in public, and that was partially why she may have died from suicide. So Chappelle talking about her in this way not only felt exploitative, as well as using a "I have a trans best friend" story in order to protect himself from criticism of his special, which we do see people using to defend Chappelle's words, with Joe Rogan saying things like this.
I saw an article. They said his transphobic statements. They're not fucking statements. They're jokes. They're not jokes that are transphobic either. They're jokes that feature trans people. They're not transphobic jokes. His whole bit in that last special that everybody was mad at is essentially a love letter to his friend that killed herself because she was supporting him and she got attacked on stage.
While also at the same time using that story to again paint transgender people as all harassers and ridiculous and over the top, leading to someone to die. Again, not to say any harassment she may have received was okay or right, but that most transgender people would condemn it and that it was wrong categorically and not something specific to the transgender community, but something we see in all online spaces today. Which then leads us back to this incident at the Hollywood Bowl. Because before the attack happened, he said that he felt like he was in danger from the transgender community, that he felt like he needed security from the transgender community. Which, by saying that, it not only paints the transgender community as harassing and hurtful and vitriolic, but actively violent. All of us, not just specific ones, but that the entire trans community is somehow ready and willing to violently assault Dave Chappelle, which any reasonable person, which is most transgender people, would not want. Again, this isn't to say that there aren't trans people who have been sending death threats to him, who would not wish harm on him. But to say that only transgender people are like that, I think is missing how this happens no matter what's the case. That you could literally point anywhere because of the way that our online discourse has become so heated and over the top and vitriolic to any point. Literally everyone gets death threats. I get death threats all the time. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a little bit. So to say that it's somehow unique to the trans community, that you feel like the trans community is going to come after you because of us being specifically trans, what this does in turn then is justify saying that we should go out and attack transgender people because they're trying to attack us. Now, I'm not saying that Dave Chappelle himself is saying that we should go and attack transgender people, but what we have seen increasingly more and more and more and more lately is a lot of public figures, such as literal Congress people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, as well as some other Congress people, saying that we should attack and harm transgender people, that it is justified to attack transgender people because of them being violent or angry. And this also dovetails, by the way, with a lot of discussions that we're seeing elsewhere surrounding how the LGBTQ community in general is being painted as sexualizing children, as groomers, as trying to harm the children. We see this with things like the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida or the anti-trans healthcare laws in Texas, that these are laws around protecting the children from the grooming LGBTQ people, instead of discussing them as the actual harmful bills that they are to discussions around LGBTQ topics, as well as hurting transgender people's healthcare. It heightens the discussions around them to the point where if you're just protecting the children with these laws and LGBTQ people and transgender people and the left wants to harm your children because of it, it thereby justifies violence against transgender people. Not just harassment, but actual violence. And because of this more and more hyperbolicized language around the LGBTQ and transgender communities, that we're seeing increasing hate crimes targeted directly at LGBTQ people in general, but specifically trans people. There has been studies showing that hate crimes against trans people are continuing to rise. We've seen this anecdotally and scientifically. I myself, I live in Seattle, which is a fairly trans-affirming place, feel unsafe in a lot of spaces now because I am transgender. I mean, specifically, I just a few weeks ago was at the supermarket and a woman started harassing me, saying that I should die from AIDS because I'm a public trans person in a space. That's all I was. I was just a trans person in a space, but she felt comfortable saying that to me because I was trans. And this is all directly linked to the fact that we're seeing this increasing hyperbolization around the transgender community as painting us all as violent harassers. And so going back to Chappelle, what I'm not saying is that I don't think Dave Chappelle shouldn't be open and honest about the fact if he feels unsafe because of things that he has gotten in terms of death threats, harassment, because of the things that he said around transgender people, and that thereby leading to him being targeted. Like, he should not receive that at all. I condemn that 150%. And he has every right to share that. But what it does do, because of the lack of nuance around saying the difference between the fringe people that are saying that and just the trans community writ large, the flattening of all of that, it paints all transgender people as these over-the-top, not nuanced, not trying to have an honest discussion and have honest, real criticisms of him and the harm that some of his words have normalized in our world today, but paints us as being justified being violent against. And so when he says something like that, and then someone attacks him, and then he makes a joke about it being a trans man. Again, I understand the context in which that joke was made, but the fact that it was immediately reached for. What we saw immediately happening after the incident is that a lot of trans people got harassment because of this incident. Trans people had nothing to do with it. Again, it was a cis man who, by the way, if you look online, actually is a Trump supporter. He did a whole rap song where he talked about wanting to harm Dave Chappelle, one, and then it did another one where he literally called Trump his president. So despite the fact that we had nothing to do with the incident directly, and the fact that the man who attacked Dave Chappelle literally has nothing to do with the transgender community, we saw a lot of people going online after the incident to, number one, say that transgender people were the people that caused this. I saw so many people in so many comment sections saying that. But not only that, then going on to harass transgender people because of this incident. I myself got new comments on my old Dave Chappelle video from months ago. New comments because people were finding it because it was a Dave Chappelle related video and he was sort of regurgitating in the algorithm because of the event that happened. And those new people were sending harassment targeted at me because I had talked about Dave Chappelle, because I was a public-facing transgender person who had mentioned Chappelle and discussed Chappelle, hopefully with nuance and not vitriol. But I got people saying to me, like, 41% yourself, which 41% yourself is a reference to the fact that 41%, there was one study that said that 41% of transgender people attempt suicide. So saying 41% yourself is saying, go kill yourself. That's the harassment that I got. And a lot of transgender people had it. Not for anything that we said, but for just being trans people publicly, after an incident that we had nothing to do with because of the way that transgender people have been continually painted as violent, harassing, and vitriolic, and deserving of being attacked. And that got even further complicated, by the way, by the fact that a lot of the reporting initially after the incident, even from places that we would even say have generally been okay about discussing trans issues, like for example, BuzzFeed I saw, did a whole article where they said, Dave Chappelle was attacked, and then the second line after that was, Dave Chappelle attacked right after he said that he felt unsafe about transgender community. The headline said nothing about the actual person that attacked Dave Chappelle, nothing about who he was, or that fact he was a cis man, had nothing to do with the transgender community. The second line literally was that he felt unsafe because of the transgender community. And so you see this direct causal link being made in the implication there. Regardless of whether that was the intention of the writer or not, the implication hangs over the air that this was in part because of the transgender community, despite the fact that we had nothing to do with it. And even, by the way, even if this had been a transgender person who had come up and attacked Dave Chappelle on stage, even if that had been the case, that still would not mean the entire transgender community is justified being attacked against, nor that we don't have honest and earnest and good critiques of what Dave Chappelle has said, nor the fact that I believe if that had happened, most transgender people, myself included, would still have condemned this trans person for having done that. But I would have said if a transgender person attacked him, that transgender person should face charges. But all of this is sort of the intention of many of these people, right? Not even talking about Dave Chappelle specifically, though I do feel like he's used this cancel culture narrative in order to further his own pocketbook to a degree. But even if we ignore Dave Chappelle, it is in a lot of many media outlets' vested interest, more ones that are more anti-transgender, like places like Fox News and Breitbart and things like that, to paint transgender people with this flat brush of all being violent harassers. Because by doing so, they can use more and more sort of these headlines that vilify transgender people in order to push legislation, further these cultural war narratives, using transgender people as the scapegoat in order to, bolster their own power, get lawmakers to get more voters in, say, like, protect yourself from the violent groomer trans people. We'll protect you with the laws that we're pushing, ignoring the fact that they're not actually pushing laws that actually really, really help people. Which is evidenced by the fact that we see with Isaiah Lee, because Dave Chappelle was open and honest a few days later about the fact that the reason Isaiah Lee attacked him was to try to draw attention to the fact that his mother was facing issues. I'm not necessarily saying we should necessarily have sympathy for a man who attacked Dave Chappelle, but the point that I sort of want to make here is that he was a man who felt like he had no recourse to draw attention to his own mother's health issues and plight, other than reacting vitriolically, hatefully, and violently against a man who he saw as a culture war figurehead of that narrative with Dave Chappelle, instead of actually wanting to vote for people who could actually help and policies that could actually help. Like, he felt so disenfranchised from all of it that because he had been so brought into these culture war narratives that people like Trump had pushed, that Isaiah supported, that he felt like it was more useful to him to violently attack a man who was making jokes on stage than any other recourse that he thought he had available to him, because he probably didn't feel like he did have any other recourse. Again, not giving him overly sympathy, but just sort of like pointing the direct link between these things of how culture war narratives ultimately don't help people, leave them feeling disenfranchised, but angry, and finding people to lash out against. Okay, thank you so much for indulging me in this conversation. I know it was a lot, and I actually had a lot more than I thought I wanted to say. I thought this was going to be a quick little video, but I ended up just kind of rambling a lot more than I intended to. But I just saw that this incident with Chappelle, not only to be an interesting one in and of itself, but that I also found it indicative of a lot of the ways we're discussing transgender people a lot in the media, and how it's become more and more vitriolic and more justifying violence and harassment against transgender people and marginalized people in general. We see similar things with like critical race theory in education, like we see with the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida. It's the same thing being enacted against racial discussions as we're seeing with transgender discussions. So I just think it's a confluence of a lot of different things that this situation is indicative of, that I just wanted to take a moment to talk about. So thank you so much for watching this. I have a few videos coming out this week, a lot of them that I'm very excited about. I'll have a video on Friday. I also have my review of Star Trek Picard Season 2 coming up on Wednesday, so be on the lookout for those. I'm very excited about all of them. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel for all of that. I have a Patreon that helps support me on. But beyond all of that, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you, as always, live long and prosper. Here we go. I know I've used this song once before, but I like it so much, so here's some more. I just want to say to my Patreons, I love you so much, and here's this song to say thank you. If it's the beat. Alex Miller, Alicia Strice, Ali Gober, Annie with an I, Ish Indra, Ashley Allenbo, Kiki Yo, Barbara Ruski, Beatrix Provers, Bella Lugosi, Blue, Blueberry Hill, Boyd and Mary Bethero, Casual Observer, Catherine Lambeth, Celestial Dawn, Chloe Dollar, Chris Boodley, Crit Facts, Cyber Quaker, D. Casaray, Dominic Noble, Drew Batch, Lygia Tativi, Elizabeth Christensen, Elijah M. Ish the Mad, Ferangato, Felicia Toast, Flynn, G-Man 42, Hacker Men, Here Reeses, Holly Walters, James Hodge, James Krivda, Jason Nutt, Jedi, Indiana Jones, Jemshin, Jennifer Fuss, Jenny Mabel, Jessica Wright, Joe Herman Hold, John Witherby, Joseph Dewey, Julie Mason, Justine, Kaylis, Kari Erin Foss, Kevin Froteg, Laura Demerol, Leoetha Boyd, Lily Gray, Luna T, Lysa, Maeve, Maggie the Goblin, Matt Chung, Meadow Whisperer, Melinda Walters, Melody Ann Winters Good, Mary Mello, Michael Godey, Miranda Janelle, Maureen the Pirate Queen, Nathan Steele, Nathil Fraughton, Nikki Gordon Bloomfield, Odd Just Odd, Peter Landers, Pissed and Twisted Garage, Randy Thompson, Sarah Bystam, Sarah Lemero, Sarah Leslie Hutchkins, Sasha M, Sean Piper, Shield Maiden 44444, Sky Skinner, Sonia Naroperdo, Spooky Heather Sylvia, Steven Richardson, Steven Clenard, Strawberry Pup Tart, Super Desi, Still Restaurato, Tiffany Danger, Transit Toronto, Troy Stull, Ulysses the Pagan, Verdux Kai, Vincent Ellington, W. Randy, E.D., Wellington Marcus, Wendell Zabizzle, William Stewart, Zoe Kerr, Zone 1 Librarian. Thank you so much to all of you, my patrons, and one final note to wrap up on. I did recently learn that sadly one member of my patron community sadly passed away recently. So for one final time, I just wish to say thank you so much to Eva Kniva for all that you gave me and all the support that you gave me. It meant the world to me, and I send you, and especially your family right now, some love.